Here is a reason Generation X sees the world differently, and it is not simply nostalgia. We have talked before about people who grew up between the 1960s and the 1980s, but this time we are going deeper. Let's begin with something that would be considered illegal today. Imagine being 6 years old, sitting on the front bench seat of your father's car. There is no seatbelt, no booster seat, just you sitting freely. The vinyl seat presses against your bare legs as the road stretches ahead. That seat gives you full control over the radio. You turn the dial slowly, searching through static for the right song. But the real moment comes when your father looks over and taps his lap. You slide across the seat and climb up carefully. You wrap both hands around the steering wheel, which feels enormous in your grip. Your father controls the pedals, but you control the road. The broken white lines pass beneath the hood one by one as you steer. By today's standards, this would be considered irresponsible parenting. But you did not experience it as recklessness. In that moment, you were not just a child. You were someone who could be trusted. Safety rules back then were closer to gentle suggestions than strict laws. Almost nobody wore seatbelts. Many people questioned why they even existed. There is another experience from that time that would never be allowed today. Your mother parks outside a store and tells you to wait in the car. She says she will only be gone for 5 minutes. You watch her walk through the doors and disappear. 5 minutes slowly becomes 10. 10 minutes quietly turns into 20. You sit watching strangers pass by the window. Your breath fogs the glass as you draw shapes with your finger. Today, safety means a notification on a screen. It means a green dot on a tracking app. It means a message saying, "Text me when you arrive." But back then, you built something else entirely. You built an internal compass while sitting alone in that parking lot. You learned that safety was not a status update. It was a feeling you carried inside your body. Once that internal compass formed, your neighborhood became your kingdom. It was no longer just a collection of houses. It became a territory that belonged to you and your friends. Think about the woods at the end of the street, or the empty lot behind the shops. Today, these places would be labeled dangerous and neglected. But to you, they were where independence was born. You spent entire afternoons building forts out of anything you could find. You dragged home discarded plywood and scraps of carpet. You borrowed milk crates left behind grocery stores. There were no instructions to follow. There were no adults there to help you. You learned how the physical world worked through trial and error. You discovered that if the boards did not overlap, rain would leak inside. You learned the pain of a splinter and how to pull a rusty nail free. You walked home with dirt under your fingernails and scrapes on your legs. But you also walked home carrying pride. You had built something that belonged only to you. That fort was a secret world where rules did not apply. It was also your first lesson in handling conflict without adults. When disagreements happened, no one stepped in to fix them. You and your friends had to solve problems yourselves. You decided who led and who followed. If you could not agree, the game simply ended. And going home alone became the consequence. Without realizing it, you were learning negotiation and compromise. You were learning how to stand your ground. You were building character while adults thought you were only playing. Then there was the bicycle. Your bike was not just a toy. It was your horse, your escape, and your first taste of real power. You spent hours customizing it. You clipped playing cards to the spokes to make engine sounds. You wrapped the handlebars with tape, or added a long seat. You memorized every shortcut through the neighborhood. You knew every ramp made from plywood and bricks. You did not need a phone to find your friends. You simply looked for a pile of bikes on a lawn. That pile was the universal signal that something was happening. You were not following a digital map. You followed noise, instinct, and memory. You were not just moving through the neighborhood. You were mastering it. You remember flying downhill on your bike with your feet lifted from the pedals. The wind hit your face as speed made everything blur. Then the front wheel struck a hidden rock. Your body lifted and flipped over the handlebars. You slammed into the pavement without warning. Gravel dug sharply into your palms. Blood immediately began running down your shin. You stood up in shock, then limped home slowly. Your knee throbbed with every step. You opened the door and walked inside. Your mother looked at you once and assessed the damage. She said you were fine and told you to wash it off. Then she told you to go back outside. So you did. You wore that scab like a medal for weeks. There were no helmets, knee pads, or elbow pads. Most kids would not even know where to buy a helmet. But you were not only exposed to danger. You were exposed to sickness as well. You entered houses full of children you barely knew. All of them stood around one miserable child. That child was covered in red, itchy spots. This was known as a chickenpox party. The goal was not to avoid illness. The goal was to catch it and move on. Mothers stood nearby drinking coffee and talking. Children shared cups, toys, and close space. Everyone knew the child was contagious. And that was the point. This created a kind of toughness that is rare today. You learned early that pain and damage were different things. Being hurt did not mean being broken. This distinction shaped how you faced problems later in life. Your confidence extended beyond play and into machines. You grew up in a world where things were not sealed shut. You could see how objects worked. You could smell oil, dust, and metal. You were expected to understand them. Think about the first time your bike chain slipped, or the first time your tire went flat. You did not wait for an expert. You flipped the bike upside down yourself. You balanced it on the seat and handlebars. You got grease on your hands and shirt. You guided the chain back onto the gear. You learned how much pressure was too much. By the time you were 10, you were not just a rider. You were a mechanic. This attitude extended into the house as well. When the television flickered, you did not panic. When the VCR image became distorted, you acted. You gave the side of the TV a firm tap. Sometimes, that was enough. If it was not, you crawled behind the cabinet. You examined the tangled wires and dust. You checked the red, white, and yellow cables. You adjusted them, carefully. And when the image snapped back into place, you felt capable. You were building mechanical intuition. You believed broken things could be fixed. This created a rare form of confidence. You did not feel helpless when things failed. You believed effort could restore order. Inside the house, discipline was clear and immediate. When you talked back, consequences followed quickly. You heard the sound before you saw it. A drawer opening was enough warning. You understood cause and effect instantly. There were no long explanations. Actions led directly to outcomes. This wiring stayed with you into adulthood. But when the weekdays ended, freedom returned. Saturday mornings felt completely different from the rest of the week. They were quiet, slow, and entirely yours. You woke up early, often before anyone else in the house. The sun was barely up when you turned on the television. You sat on the floor in your pajamas, close to the screen. Cartoons filled the room with color and sound. For a few hours, that television became a portal. Shows like The Flintstones, Scooby-Doo, or Transformers played once and then vanished. If you missed them, they were gone for good. There was no replay and no second chance. This taught you something powerful about time. Some moments only happen once. Being present mattered. The world was not going to wait for you. School reinforced that lesson in a different way. Education was slow, physical, and final. Without the internet, your brain had to store information. Knowledge lived inside your head, not in your pocket. If you wanted to know something, You had to truly learn it. You could not look things up mid-conversation. Dates, facts, and names had to be memorized. You remember the sound of the copying machine at school. Purple ink covered worksheets that were still damp. The smell of chemicals filled the classroom. Today, students open digital files with a tap. Back then, you held a pencil and a single sheet of paper. Mistakes could not be undone instantly. You had to erase them carefully. Smudges remained as reminders. This taught you that actions carried weight. Writing required patience and focus. You did not have multiple tabs open. There were no constant notifications. You followed one idea at a time. You trained your mind for deep concentration. Research was not instant either. It required effort and movement. You stood in front of wooden card catalogs. You pulled open long drawers filled with index cards. You searched letter by letter. Finding information felt like a hunt. Because it took work, it felt valuable. Outside of school, social life existed in physical spaces. The shopping mall became your social network. You were dropped off at the entrance with limited cash. You were not there to shop seriously. You were there to observe and be seen. You walked slow loops past the food court and stores. Every glance taught you something about social dynamics. You learned who was friendly and who was trouble. You learned where you belonged. Identity was physical, not digital. If you wanted to be part of a group, you dressed like it. Band shirts, jackets, boots, and hairstyles mattered. You chose your tribe with your appearance. But you also had to defend that choice in person. There was no screen to hide behind. You could not curate yourself. You had to live your identity. Work entered your life early. Your first job was not symbolic. It was real responsibility. People depended on you to show up. You woke up before sunrise. You worked in silence while others slept. You carried weight that felt heavy for your age. You learned discipline through routine. You learned pride through effort. Money did not appear automatically. You earned it physically. Your paycheck was a piece of paper. You held it carefully in your hands. You stood in line at the bank. You watched the teller process it. That moment taught you value. After school, you returned to an empty house. A key hung around your neck. The silence inside felt normal. You were in charge of your time. No one scheduled your afternoon. Boredom arrived often, and boredom forced creativity. You learned to entertain yourself. Communication required courage. You memorized phone numbers. You dialed them carefully. You spoke to parents before friends. You learned respect early. You learned patience while waiting. When you went out at night, you disappeared. No one tracked your location. There were no permanent records. Mistakes faded with time. You were allowed to experiment privately. Even love required patience. Affection moved slowly. Mixtapes took hours to make. Every song was chosen with intention. Effort became a form of honesty. Because it was difficult, it meant more. Making a mixtape was an act of patience and vulnerability. You sat there, watching the tape spin in real time. You pressed play and record with precise timing. You rewound and waited again. Every mistake meant starting over. You wrote the track list by hand. Sometimes you decorated the case yourself. You were giving someone a physical piece of your effort. And because it required work, it carried meaning. All of these experiences trained you for the long game of life. You learned to wait without panic. You learned to work without praise. You learned to fail without collapsing. When you look at the world today, it can feel unfamiliar. Sometimes it feels like you landed on a different planet. But you are not outdated. You are carrying abilities that are becoming rare. Self-reliance that looks like stubbornness is actually competence. Comfort with silence that looks like distance is actually depth. Patience that looks like indifference is actually discipline. You grew up with freedom, but you were never lost. You learned responsibility early. You learned consequences firsthand. You were trusted before you were protected. That trust shaped your internal compass. You do not need constant guidance to move forward. You plan, adapt, and act on your own judgment. This is why modern chaos does not shake you easily. You know how to operate without supervision. You know how to endure discomfort. You know how to stay present without distraction. You learned these things long before they were rare. You came from a world where childhood was still physical. Rewards were earned, not delivered instantly. Time could not be rewound. Attention could not be split endlessly. Because of that, moments mattered more. Every time you feel out of place today, remember this. You are not broken. You are not behind. You are carrying forward skills that modern life no longer teaches. You were shaped by a world that demanded resilience, and resilience became part of who you are. Your strength is quiet, but it is real. Your confidence does not announce itself. It shows up when things fall apart. You have trusted yourself since childhood. That trust has guided you ever since. You are still navigating by the same internal compass, and you always will.